Hi there, everyone. Welcome to our latest Insight Collaborative webinar. This time it's on the subject of pushbacks. My name's Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us. We actually spoke about pushbacks last year in a webinar, which you can find on our YouTube channel, which I'll paste in the chat box. We wanted to talk about them again because there's been a lot of developments since last year. It's been a very fast-moving topic. Even UNHCR have been talking about them recently. So we've brought together a panel of people who have been looking at pushbacks from very different angles and who have experienced them from kind of different positions. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves in person. And I'll just start with going around my screen, so in an entirely random order. Ruhi, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello everyone, my name is Ruhi Lauren Akhtar and I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called Refugee Biryani and Bananas. We are a UK-based charity, UK-registered charity, but we are based on the Greek island of Chios, and we are also doing some work in Athens as well, where we are providing humanitarian aid and doing advocacy work as well. Today I will be focusing particularly on pushbacks in regards to the Poland, Lithuania, Belarus border crises.
Thank you, Ruhi. Francesco, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, my name is Francesco Luigi Gatta. I'm Italian, and I've been dealing with pushbacks and other human rights violations at the borders under two different angles. Let's say, from a point of view of academia, I'm a researcher in European law, and this is where I've been studying those phenomena. And on the other hand, I'm also a lawyer. I usually deal with cases and applications at the European Court of Human Rights. And this is where also I spent a period of working there. I mean, at the Court of Strasbourg last year, working side by side with the judge of Poland, Judge Wojciech. And this is where also I had the chance to, witness few cases regarding indeed this problematic border between Belarus and Poland, especially. So that's my background.
Thank you. And last but not least, we come to Jennifer.
Hello. Just before I introduce myself, I don't know if possibly there's connection issues on your side, Daniel. I was having trouble hearing you before, but it could also be mine. So I don't know if anyone else is having some challenges. So hopefully you can hear me okay now. But yes, my name is Jennifer Foster. I am a researcher and migrant rights advisor for Amnesty International. I work for the International Secretariat, currently based in London. Without getting into too much details, I have done some work on pushbacks, in particular, working on a report last year that we released on pushbacks at the Greek-Turkey border, the land border in particular. I also worked on the Poland-Belarus situation as well, penning our outputs in December on that particular situation.
Thank you, Jennifer. I apologize in advance if there are any connection issues. Oh dear. Francesco, Ruhi, can you both hear me? Okay. It might be at your end, Jennifer, or it might be at mine. I think after the storms, there have been some connection issues all around the country. So yes, I apologize to our audience as well if there are any connection issues today. We will be uploading this to YouTube afterwards as well, so you can catch it there if you have connection issues. The way this webinar will run is that we have some questions that we would love to ask our panelists, and we will be asking those one by one, but we'd also love to hear from the audience as well. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask, please do type them into the chat box and I will relay them to our panelists at an appropriate time. But to start us off, our first question is, what effects, if any, has the pandemic had on the practice of pushbacks at borders around the world within the context that you've been working with? Ruhi, would you like to start us off with that?
I mean, since the coronavirus pandemic has started and it's been ongoing, we are aware that there has been more reports and testimonies and evidence that more pushbacks are happening. Now, I don't know whether, the authorities have been using this as an excuse or as a means to do it more, but definitely there's been an increase.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on this, Francesco?
Yeah, well, I also believe that there might have been an increase in the pushbacks and in this kind of informal way of, removing migrants from the border, from the territory. Also, what the pandemic has brought on the scene is probably additional issues in terms of protection of human rights, for example, in terms of detention or deprivation of liberty, or even protection of health, with migrants being kept together, detained together, of course, regardless of any kind of, measure of social distance and then precaution with regard to the coronavirus. I'm also thinking of, for example, the episode of the so-called quarantine ships, those ships coming to Italy, for example, to Malta or these other countries in the south of Europe, where migrants were kept there for days, if not for weeks. And so this, on the one hand, of course, I mean, this was justified, at least formally, invoking the pandemic and the reasons relating to containing the spread of the virus. But on the other end, that's of course the perspective of the state and of the state agent and state authorities. But on the other hand, of course, this raises, I think, a number of questions in terms of human rights, especially deprivation of personal liberty. So I would say the pandemic possibly has added this kind of additional issues maybe to the whole situation. Yeah.
Thank you. And Jennifer, what are your thoughts on this first question?
I certainly think that the pandemic has given states the power, if you will, to legitimize their pushback practices. We've seen around the globe, actually, a number of situations that cropped up that were not necessarily problematic prior to the pandemic really kind of hitting in gosh, what year are we in now? 2020 was when it started, around March 2020. At this point in time, I have no idea whether or not you can hear me because I can't see anyone, but I'm going to assume that you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, great, good, I'm glad. In terms of pushbacks that were happening in Europe in particular, and also in the United States and some other kind of high receipt countries, if you will, of people when they tend to be migrating or looking for asylum, we definitely saw an uptick in those practices. And now it seems as though these practices are becoming more normalized, and that's really what's so dangerous and frightening, with the pandemic, that it's given the opportunity to kind of make these practices standardized, and even more so, we're seeing, some countries, particularly on the borders of the EU, trying to encode in domestic law ways to prevent people from accessing their right to claim asylum, and so kind of standardizing pushbacks as a practice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's in some ways it feels like that's been a long-term trend. Something that we've been seeing for quite a while now is the gradual restriction of the different ways that people can access the asylum procedure, but it definitely feels like it's ramped up in certain areas over the last few years as well. So the next question is, I suppose we could spend hours and hours talking about this one question, but it's what concerns do you have about the ways pushback practices are evolving and developing? Francesco, would you like to start us off with this one?
Yep, sure. So, well, I think how pushbacks are evolving and developing, probably, yeah, there is a consolidated way of carrying out those practices, a kind of standardized practice by border guards and border authorities. Probably there is a lot of violence there also in the treatment of migrants at the borders. The behavior of border guards is increasingly becoming aggressive and violent towards migrants. Also, typically pushbacks are informal conduct by the state agents. It's really difficult to to prove that a pushback has happened. And border guards know that, or I think this is also why they usually confiscate personal belongings of migrants, like documents, papers, documentation, mobile phones. Mobile phones may be a tool for recording, for example, a video, taking a picture, or witnessing something that is happening at the border. And state agents, border guards probably know that. They know that perfectly. So they tend to confiscate those belongings from taking them away from migrants. I mean, confiscating would probably entail a legal procedure, a formal legal process of confiscating something, which is not even the case. So it's just taking away. It's a robbery, basically, taking away those objects from the migrants, including, again, documentation, personal belongings, money, and mobile phones, which is also a tool of getting in touch with a lawyer, with your family, with someone from an NGO, someone that can help you. So migrants are left basically without any means of communication, any means of proving what happened to them, and they are just simply pushed back violently and unlawfully. So I believe that is a worrying, alarming trend that we're especially witnessing in the recent period. Yeah, and I'm afraid this is something that is going to continue in the next period. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think what you're saying there is really reinforcing what Jennifer said in answer to the previous question, that there has been a real normalization of the practice here. And it sounds like there's also been a normalization of greater violence and what's the word I'm looking for? Almost hostility towards even the idea of asylum as well. Jennifer, can we turn to you next, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with what Francesco was saying. I do believe that the pushbacks are becoming more violent. And what we have to remember is that pushbacks in and of itself is not, a legal term. Essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about a pushback is we're talking about someone who has been unlawfully expelled from the territory of a country without an individual protection assessment. So there's no way to understand what danger someone might face, which is particularly in Europe, someone's right. So that's happening. And then pushbacks often are accompanied by or enacted through the use of other violations, such as arbitrary detention, massive amounts of violence that we've seen, confiscation of personal belongings, all of those things that Francesco was saying. And the amount of violence, including unfortunately, deprivation of life. So if we're talking very plainly, people are being killed in these pushbacks or beaten very severely in some of them as well. These these violations are virtually unprovable in many ways. So the evidence is all taken, and it's very difficult due to jurisdictional requirements in some countries to have any access to a legal remedy once someone has been pushed back or expelled from the territory. So it is very frightening to see the level of violence and the level of impunity. So for example, in Greece, these pushbacks have been documented by Amnesty International for nearly a decade, and they really read exactly the same way as they have for the last decade. So if you look back in the history of, Amnesty International reports on the subject, people are being expelled not only from the border region, but they're also being taken from within the state territory. And this is happening in other locations as well. So pushbacks at the border are certainly, reprehensible, they're illegal, all of these things are true, but it's a whole nother situation when we have people who are being taken from refugee camps or being taken, in city centers or, a number of other locations where they are lawfully present and even have, the requisite documentation of their status. They're being completely ignored by authorities. They're being arbitrarily detained, just for simply walking around in a city square or something like that. And in our recent report, we documented several of those cases, and they're devastating. We've talked to people who have been pushed back, dozens of times potentially, and some, have been pushed back even if they have the right to remain in Europe, as in citizens or people who have already been granted asylum. And with the other kind of terrifying thing that we have seen is the cooperation of multiple arms of state authorities in enacting these pushbacks and cooperating with non-state actors potentially in carrying them out. So again, that's something that we highlighted in our report last year. But we saw similar things happening in Belarus very recently. And along the Polish border in particular, and it's systemic, and it is the de facto policy in some states now to simply push people back or capture them and send them sometimes hundreds of kilometers across the state in order to expel them illegally.
Absolutely. I think what you said about there being greater state involvement, cooperation and sanction of the pushbacks is, for me at least, the most disturbing aspect of them really, is that it is essentially state-sanctioned violence and in some cases state-sanctioned murder. Ruhi, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, like Francesco and Jennifer have already gone into quite a bit of detail about our concerns regarding pushbacks. Just to give you a bit of background, I went to volunteer in Poland and Lithuania at the end of November when there was a huge crisis escalating, which is still ongoing at the Belarus border. And what we were doing was we were supporting people who had made it out of the emergency zone into the forest areas. And I'm just going to tell you some of the things that people had been telling me, just so maybe we can like kind of relate it to the person who's being affected by some of the things Francesco and Jennifer said. So, they were saying things like they've been pushed backwards back into the countries and back out of the country as well, pushed back, the violence, the robbery, the documents being taken. And since I've come away from Poland and Lithuania, I've been doing Urdu translations for some of the testimonies that the organizations there have been taking as well. And yes, there's been death and the torture that people have experienced. Say it's torture, I would actually call it, because most recently I took a testimony for a group of 4 Pakistani men, and they said things like they were beaten, they were sprayed in the face, they were stripped naked, and then they were made to walk around like frogs on the ice and the snow, which when you hear these things, and this is what people are really going through, not only are their fundamental rights to seek asylum being denied from them, but they're being tortured, and this is happening on European soil, which is absolutely atrocious and hugely concerning, not only Poland, Lithuania, but other countries like at the Greece-Turkey border as well. And I really don't know where we go from here, because it seems like there's no humanity left when people are going through this in Europe.
Absolutely. It doesn't matter how many times I hear those stories, they're always really quite shocking. And that's the most incomprehensible part, isn't it? You know, if it's a state policy, then no matter how much we may disagree with it, then you can at least see what it is they're attempting to achieve with that. But what are they attempting to achieve by making people walk around like frogs in the snow and ice? It's just dreadful. So the next question then is around what you or your organisations have been doing around pushbacks. So kind of asking you to talk a little bit about any work that you may have done. Now, obviously, we're aware that there's an issue around criminalisation of humanitarians, which is also getting worse and worse. We've also talked about that in our webinars before as well. And obviously, we wouldn't want you to talk about anything that might endanger anybody. But if there is anything that you can talk about the work that you or your organisation have been doing, we would love to hear it. Jennifer, would you like to start us off on that one?
I had a feeling I'd get called on first. Yes, I mean, unfortunately, you know, kind of as Ruhi was lamenting, it's a pretty tough environment out there right now. You know, Amnesty International is a, and I, you know, apologies for continually saying Amnesty International, but we are a global organization, and that is one of the benefits of kind of having the reach. Our colleagues working in various country section offices are actually quite involved in this. So our European regional offices in particular have quite a strong kind of movement and collaborative work with various, you know, sections in Europe to advocate for the support of humanitarian actors. So the campaign is really about the criminalization of solidarity, which is kind of a mouthful, but it is. It's, you know, it's there are letter writing campaigns, there are, you know, activities that people can become involved in their countries, you know, demonstrations. There are several ways that people can become involved if you do join one of these movements. And of course, we also have you know, partnerships with people throughout Europe. So people like, you know, Francesco and Ruhi, who are you know, working on various legal aspects. So we work with lawyers in countries where people are being criminalized. We support them in a number of ways that, you know, it's certainly possible to become involved. Those are the kinds of things that Amnesty tends to take on. We've also worked at we're starting to look more kind of at the global level as well. So we have a lot of work within the European mechanisms, simply because that's where a lot of this has happened in the past. But last year, in June at the Human Rights Council, actually at about the same time we were releasing our report on pushbacks on Greece, the special rapporteur for migration released a similar report also in June, and about the same day actually, on pushbacks globally. And that is something that you know, I've also worked on with other colleagues around the world. So this is a global trend. It's not going away. So the Human Rights Council, there was, you know, a side event about it specifically. Amnesty International, you know, had an intervention. But states are, I mean, some of them are just belligerent, to be honest. So the response of Greece continues to be outright denial when there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. And, you know, the situation in Belarus and Poland, of course, what we documented was that we have pushbacks happening on both sides. So, you know, Belarusian authorities were repeatedly subjecting people to be pushed into Poland and or Lithuania, even if they didn't want to go. And then, you know, of course, those states are repeatedly, you know, just kind of pushing them back to Belarus. So they're kind of getting ping-ponged across the border, and we see that a lot throughout the world. So, you know, in practical matters, people can absolutely become part of these movements. You know, you should, you know, lobby MPs. I don't know what countries everyone is from, who might be listening today, but, there are certainly ways to make your voice heard and ensure that your state or country authorities know that you do not believe or agree with these practices and that they are illegal and they are not a legitimate form of border control. To frame it more positively, what we can say is that there is a possible way to protect security interests of a state, as well as ensuring people's rights are respected when they are seeking asylum. So that's kind of my long-winded answer.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's really good to hear that there are so many avenues there that to work on it at least. And I guess from the largest, or one of the largest of the big NGOs down to a very small grassroots NGO, Ruhi, you mentioned you'd done some translation work around this. Is that something you'd like to tell us more about?
Yeah, so I've been doing translation work for anybody needing Urdu translation for some of the pushback testimonies. So again, there are grassroots organizations and other organizations who are taking testimonies from people who have experienced pushbacks. And that is something that, organizations and volunteers or aid workers trained to do this can do, and that is a useful tool. But bearing in mind that not everybody who has been pushed back wants to give a testimony, because they are often fearful that if they are to come public or give a testimony, that it will affect their asylum claims. Even if it's anonymous, they will still be scared about that. So that's something that can be done. There are other things like campaign work, petitions, lobbying your MP, supporting advocacy efforts as well. And again, like we have to be quite careful in what we're doing, what we say, how we promote things online. As Daniel mentioned, there is criminalization of aid workers happening as well, which is a deep worry.
Yes, very much so. That hostile environment that is being created both for humanitarians and for asylum seekers is very disconcerting. Francesco, I believe you've done some work on that as well, haven't you? You've done some kind of legal work, you said, around pushbacks. If you'd like to talk a bit about that.
Yes, indeed. Well, first, when I deal with the students at university and when I teach, I try to explain, all these problems, and especially this black hole of legality, which is happening along the European borders. And the most striking thing is to see the reaction of students, who are really surprised, and they kind of say, really? I mean, is this happening in Europe, really? Where is the rule of law? Where is, the habeas corpus? Where is all, these centuries of legal, philosophical, also, if you will, culture of protecting human rights and so on. So they are really surprised, and so it's interesting in a way to engage with them in those kind of discussions. When it comes to the practice, the legal practice, I've been dealing with cases and applications at the Court of Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights. And by the way, it's nice to be here today discussing pushback, because today it's an anniversary, so to say. It's 10 years from the famous judgment Irsi Jama against Italy. It was the 23rd of February 2012, so it's 10 years ago already. But still, I mean, we are still talking about pushbacks, unfortunately, 10 years later. Not in the Mediterranean, in the forests between Poland and Belarus, but we are still there talking about pushbacks. So what I've been dealing with recently, in particular, it's 2 applications that have been filed recently, as a matter of fact, against Greece. So these are about pushbacks happening at the land border between Turkey and Greece, in the Evros region. And by the way, I'm addressing Jennifer. We used the the report that you prepared, Violence, Lies, and Pushbacks, that was very helpful for us, and we so I hope that the court will take that into account. I can't disclose too much details, but the case is peculiar because it's about a number of applicants, one of which was a French citizen. A young woman holding a French citizenship, and he has been pushed back together with other migrants from Syria, from Afghanistan. And of course, from a legal point of view, her legal status as French citizen put her in a quite strong legal position, theoretically. And this shows that, you know, Greece doesn't really care. I mean, it's really a collective expulsion, a collective, immediate and collective expulsion without even bothering, you know, to check the documents, because she had her French passport with them, with her when traveling. So Greek authorities didn't really care about that, and she was pushed back along with other migrants. So this shows that the situation really is out of control, and there is no rule of law whatsoever there. So this is a recent, this is an example of a recent case I've been dealing with, which shows that, yeah, especially in Greece, in Turkey, the situation there is particularly tense. Also, that it's a hot area for pushbacks, of course, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you. Now that really does confirm, doesn't it, that that there is no care for the rule of law in Greece, and that they are just throwing people out without any concern at all for what they're doing. On the other hand, it is good to hear about the links between you, about using, you know, resources that the others have produced and so on. That's really nice to hear, actually. We've had a question in the chat. I'm not going to call upon anyone in particular to answer that, because all of the questions I've been asking so far have been sent to our panelists in advance so that they can consider what their answer might be and what they'd like to talk about, whereas of course this one has been sprung upon you. But I'll read it out, and then anyone who would like to chime in is very welcome to do so. David has asked, what do you guys think about the argument from some governments that say that pushbacks and denying asylum are justified, so migrants are deterred to migrate, and therefore they are safe from smugglers who they say are exploiting migrants? Does anyone have anything they'd like to say about that?
I definitely do. And Ruhi, I see that you unmuted, so I'll let you talk first.
You want to go first? I don't mind.
No, please do.
I think it's not justified to say this, and I think anybody that wants to use this as an argument actually doesn't understand about the right to seek asylum and what it means to need refugee status, because these people would not be traveling and trying to claim asylum if they had a choice. They can't live in their countries due to conflict, oppression, war, poverty, different reasons, and then there's other countries in the middle which they can't either stay in as well. So I think, you know, they're not understanding the system, and yes, smugglers are exploiting them, but actually the authorities and the governments are also exploiting them and using them in hybrid wars, using them as pawns in deadly games of chess where they're supposed to be human beings, but they're not being treated that way. So I don't think it's a justified argument at all.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, no surprise, we're not going to agree with that assessment. I don't think anyone listening to this would, but it's a great question, David, because it is one that's kind of trotted out quite often, these deterrence mechanisms. And so, you know, we certainly have postulations and theories about the level of violence, for example, as a deterrence mechanism, even though it is obviously illegal. However, you know, the silly part of this argument from various states is that they're saying that, you know, they're trying to save these poor migrants from smugglers. And really what's happening is, because of the very restrictive policies and virtually no safe or legal routes in order to migrate, you know, appropriately, if you want to say that, even though people are legally allowed to seek asylum and enter a country in order to do so, is that they're actually driving the business for smugglers. Like, we have not done official research, so I cannot make a statement on behalf of Amnesty, certainly on this point. But there are a number of media sources, as well as some anecdotal evidence that we frequently hear from people that we're speaking to. And smugglers themselves even. I can't remember who wrote a fantastic article about this recently, but the tighter the restrictions are, and kind of the stronger the deterrence mechanisms are from states, kind of the more money that they're putting in the pocket of smugglers, because people will move. That's the thing, is people have always moved. Migration is not a bad thing, and I think that's what we have to kind of constantly challenge in popular narratives and things, is that people have always moved. I'm a migrant worker. Like, I'm not from here. So I've migrated to Kenya. I worked in Kenya for a long time. I've worked in different countries, and people do this. They look for better lives through migration, for work and a variety of reasons. And when all of these roadblocks are put up, it's actually creating more problems, because people are exploited for labor. Trafficking occurs, and smuggling. And by the way, those are two different things legally. So they're often conflated by state officials, particularly when drumming up, support for their anti-migration agendas. But yeah, they're actually making it more lucrative for smugglers, because people will pay more and more to get out of the situations that they're in. And people are looking for better lives for their families and for themselves. And I'm a mother. I would stop at nothing to save my children and to give them a better life if that's what I had to do, and that's what everybody else is doing. So
Absolutely. I think you both made some really good points there. I'd like to add on a couple of things. The first of which is kind of related to what you said, Jennifer, that I think you're absolutely right, that the smugglers aren't creating the need, and in fact, governments with their harsh policies generally are creating a lot of the demand for smugglers' services, as well as their restriction of more legitimate or publicly accepted routes to asylum. And you see it time and again with all kinds of commodities. If you shut off all legal routes to acquiring something, people will create and find illegal routes. You even see it with prohibition in the US, to use a very different example. And that is what we've been seeing worldwide, really, is legitimate routes to claiming asylum made harder and harder to obtain and to find and even to understand. So it's not surprising that some people are turning to illegal routes. Yeah, and I also just wanted to say, if people are claiming this, people are claiming that migrants are deterred, but there's pretty much zero evidence of that. I know that you can't say this, Jennifer, from an Amnesty perspective, because that report hasn't been done, because that research hasn't been done. But I've yet to come across any research at all that suggests that violent pushbacks actually deter migration, or even that hostile policies towards asylum deter migration either. I used to work in the immigration detention sector here in the UK with a charity supporting people in immigration detention, not in the detention centres themselves. And they're dreadful places, but they don't deter migration. They are sadistic and awful for no good reason, essentially. So I'm not even aware of any evidence that this deterrence really exists. We've had another question sent to me anonymously, which is talking about the legal side of things, specifically with regards to the difficulty of proving pushbacks. Someone sent me an anonymous question basically saying that you've said, referring to the panelists in general, I think, that migrants have their phones confiscated, but are there other reasons? Are there legal reasons why it's hard to prove pushbacks? You know, even if there was video evidence, would it be possible to prove that a pushback had taken place? And if not, why not? And again, I won't be calling on anyone there, but if anyone has anything to say to that, then please do jump in.
Well, maybe can I say something? Yeah, maybe this is okay. Thanks. I'm taking also again this case because it's something that I've been recently working on. In that case, the use of mobile phone was crucial because the applicant once she entered the Greek territory, she sent the geolocation on WhatsApp to her family in France, saying, "Look, I'm here. I made it. On est passé." That was the message in French. We have passed. I'm here. I'm there. I'm in the European Union. You know, so I'm safe. The family received the message and started to to contact the diplomatic authorities, the French embassy, and all of that. But then at a certain point, the phone was taken away. So there was no way of keeping track of her moving around. And that's exactly the proof, the demonstration that she was in Greece. So that's the crucial point of evidence, showing that she was there. And then she was then pushed back because then now she's in Turkey. She's in prison, detained in Turkey now. So I would say one of the main issues, legally speaking, is exactly the one of jurisdiction. So when it comes to the Court of Strasbourg, for example, the European Convention of Human Rights, in order to trigger the convention and the protection of the European Convention, you need to prove the jurisdiction. You need to be within the jurisdiction of a state. And so let's say to prove that you have touched somehow the territory of the state, that you managed to reach the border, somehow to put your feet on the ground on the Greek territory or on the Polish territory, or so that's one crucial point, which may be related to having evidence using mobile phones and those kind of things. Yeah, and I'm also thinking about, just to add one last thing, I'm also thinking about the situation at the Polish-Belarusian border with these people that are left exactly in between the two countries in a no man's land. And so as long as Poland manages to keep them out, jurisdiction won't be triggered theoretically. So this is also the logic of keeping migrants away from the borders, because otherwise jurisdiction will be triggered, and so the state responsibility may be challenged, may be invoked before the courts. Yeah. So this is one thing I would observe when it comes to to this.
Yeah, thanks for taking that, Francesco, because that's really, so much of it is I'm not doing the work that you're doing, and so that's something that we've noted, though, certainly, that people have very few avenues because of the jurisdiction issues, and once you're out of the country and you've been pushed back, and you can't prove that you were there, then there's really very little that can be done. In addition to kind of what you're saying, I just wanted to highlight as well what Ruhi mentioned earlier, which is that many people, despite suffering, numerous pushbacks, still intend to keep coming and keep going. And so that is another challenge to this problem, and truly tackling it, is that people are terrified of speaking out. And so even if they'll anonymously speak to an organization like Ruhi's or like ours, and give us their statements, they will not be identified. Most of the time they will not agree to be identified. Migrants are by their nature migratory, so most people are in kind of very temporary situations, or they're moving around a lot. It's hard to keep track of people. I mean, there are a lot of challenges to kind of getting through here. you know, I had forgotten to mention, I just wanted to throw in as well that earlier when we were talking about what people can practically do, you know, if you've got money to give, you should be giving them to lawyers. and also, you know, organizations like Ruhi's that support people. But in terms of actually challenging, I mean, there is so much need for legal services, and there's just so little capacity, you know, there because of the financial constraints. I mean, lawyers are breaking their necks, working around the clock, completely burnt out, and, you know, emotionally spent and exhausted trying to find remedies for people and access justice. And so that is something that people should not minimize, is that, you know, financial contributions, even if you're not physically there, you know, maybe rather than spending £2,000 going somewhere, give your £2,000 to an organization that's, you know, looking for legal remedies for people, or, you know, buy something for someone who's already there and knows what they're up to and how to navigate the systems that exist.
Absolutely, completely agree with you on the importance of human rights lawyers and the work that they do. And I would argue this is also why many governments are making cuts to legal aid, is to try and hinder the work that they're doing and make it that much harder. We've got one more question. We always try and end with a slightly more optimistic question because a lot of the topics we discuss are intrinsically quite depressing. So this last question is about what we can do. What legal and intellectual routes are there that we can take to challenge pushbacks? And that applies to, I guess, people in all sorts of situations. You know, something that I'm really appreciating about this particular panel is the diversity that we have. You know, we have people from very large INGOs, we have people from very small grassroots organisations, and we have people approaching this from an academic and legal perspective. So I'd love to hear from each of you on what people in those respective organisations can do, but also what the general public can do as well. How can we challenge pushbacks? How can we stop this dreadful trend from getting worse? Ruhi, would you like to start us off with that one?
So I would say everybody can do something simple like sharing a social media post on pushbacks, to signing a petition, to writing to your MPs as well. You know, you've got different levels of organizations and your involvement can be, as you can manage, to as high as you want, to, you know, being part of an organization or volunteering or being part of an advocacy campaign. But everybody can do something, and I think it's really important that we all do our bit, because this is a horrendous action, and if not them, it could have been us. And I think it's really important that we all speak out against this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruhi. Francesco, have you got anything to say on this?
Yeah. Well, I would say that what can be done is talk about it, definitely, because indifference is one of the most, I mean, the biggest enemies of pushback. Those phenomena are happening daily, on a daily basis, at the borders of Europe. You know, of the modern and civilized Europe. This is what is happening every day. So this must be put in the spotlight. There must be discussions about that. There must be, yeah. So I would say probably the easiest way to contribute is to be informed, to keep. To be informed, to be updated, to discuss what it is happening there, to take part in different kind of events, conferences, reading a lot, getting informed about what it is happening. Otherwise, it would remain in the shadow, in this gray zone, in this obscure kind of black hole of legality and information. So we need to shed light on that and be informed about that. So I would say one of the easiest solutions is to be involved, to be active, to look for information, of course, reliable information, because there are a lot of fake news about that. There are a lot of information that are artificially fabricated by the governments, by the media controlled by the governments. So tending to, of course, offer a different narrative, positive somehow narrative of pushbacks, which is not the case. So we need to find and select the good, accurate news, and to stay informed, and to talk about that in a proper way.
Absolutely. Staying informed is crucial, whether you are in the field or whether you are a kind of ally in the general public. It's really important to stay informed. I'm going to, on that subject, I've posted Insight's social media links into the chat, and I'd also like to invite our panelists to post any news sources or research sources that you find particularly credible and helpful. And while you're doing that, I'd just like to turn to Jennifer for your thoughts on this question as well.
Yes, there are so many things, as Ruhi was saying, that can be done. I do think that because of the way these negative narratives have been spun in the public, we have to be very, very conscious that this is being done deliberately, and that in order to counter those narratives, you cannot contribute to them by repeating them. So rather than, you know, kind of getting in Facebook arguments with people, I would suggest taking practical steps to have conversations with people in your community about migrants. There are, if you are in the UK, and there are other countries as well that are participating in this, but one of the most supportive things that you could do potentially is actually to be involved in a community sponsorship group for refugees. I don't know if your organization or collective is really aware of this, but the UK, as well as other European countries, have started opening up the ability for community groups to actually sponsor the resettlement of refugees. Now, these individuals who would be resettled in the UK in particular would be coming, you know, through a referral through UNHCR. So these are not people who are, you know, kind of coming and claiming asylum at the border, but that's a really amazing, you know, community effort that you can participate in to directly support individuals in need of resettlement. And you know, it's a really cool community activity too. You know, people get to do a lot of fun stuff together in supporting people who need a fresh start. And you know, that does require a lot of commitment, though, you know, and organizing for good reason, but supporting other, you know, migrant businesses, and, you know, talking about migration in a positive way. If you are an employer, for example, there are ways to employ people. There's a fantastic organization called Talent Beyond Borders that has been doing some really interesting work on hiring people around the world, or, you know, kind of connecting with employers to hire people who would be eligible for refugee resettlement potentially, or are refugees in the country where they are currently located, but they're hiring them through regular employment visas, giving them a new start. But I think that's probably, like, so much of what's needed is just a better understanding and positive view on migration overall, and a refusal to accept that you know, European states in particular, or I mean, really, as I said before, it's a global phenomenon, but that, you know, we can't accept pushbacks or, you know, prevention of entry as a legitimate form of border control, because it simply is just too horrendous and it violates too many rights. It's not something that can be done, and you know, kind of maintain the integrity of the human rights, and excuse me, not the human rights, maintain the integrity of rule of law within Europe and within various states.
What you just closed with there, Jennifer, really struck me as demonstrating how much we as a society have lost sight of the point of these laws and conventions. because you just said, about talking about the integrity of these laws, and then I feel like that links in very well with something that Francesco said about how a lot of states are now essentially keeping people off their soil, because if they can keep them off their soil, then they don't have to trigger those protocols, those asylum protocols. And isn't that just incredible, as completely missing the point of those laws and completely losing the ethics and the genuine integrity behind those laws' creation in order to live up to the letter of those laws? I just find that really remarkable, to be honest. I think that brings us to, we're just coming up to 6 o'clock now. Does anyone have any final words they'd like to share with the audience before we sign off?
Well, if I may, just one final thing that, I mean, yeah, it's a bit. We said that we would have tried to be a little bit more optimistic, but this is actually something that is actually sad, and this Rui mentioned that before also, is this new, is not new, but it's in the spotlight now, this trend of exploiting migrants. And the case of Belarus is absolutely striking. I've been reading about this way of weaponizing refugees, so turning people into weapons, into tools for threatening, for attacking another state. And this is what Belarus has apparently has been doing recently, by attracting migrants in its territory, by granting visas, by offering cheap flights to the capital, to Minsk, by hosting migrants in the hotels in the capital with a false promise of then being accompanied to Europe, to the border with Europe, and then they are just left there in the cold and in the forest, in the rain, in really harsh, terrible, inhuman conditions, degrading conditions. So this is something really also that is quite sad. This instrumental use of people, really, because it's taking a phenomenon that is absolutely natural. We are all migrants in a way. I am myself. So it's something very, very, very natural, really, that is turned into something, at the expenses of people for pursuing other interests. So yeah, this is not really optimistic, but it's something that also needs to be discussed and to be put in the spotlight. I think this new way of weaponizing people, as I read in an article recently.
Yeah. The only, I guess, other thought that I might want to leave everyone with is that kind of in that vein is we have to remember that a lot of these policies have, racism and nationalism and other things at their core. And we have to challenge that just as much as we're challenging, kind of the symptom of the problem, which is the pushbacks. So in that way, please don't forget to remember, excuse me, woo, it's getting late. Please don't forget to center people with lived experience as much as possible and elevate their voices rather than taking the spotlight ourselves. It's something that NGOs like Amnesty are certainly working on. We have not got it right yet. There are organizations all over the world, that are working on this, and it's vital. So by partnering with people with lived experience, it makes the calls that much more legitimate and heartfelt, if you will. So support people wherever possible to tell their stories, or simply just, having to tell their stories over and over is not very nice, but rather, ensure that people have the space to advocate for themselves.
Lovely. I think that's a really nice point to end it on, actually. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Ruhi Lauren Akhtar, Francesco Luigi Gatta, and Jennifer Foster. And a thank you to our audience as well for your questions and your interest. Please do keep an eye on our social media for announcements of any upcoming events. And we'll hope to see you again at an event very soon. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.